When does the turn in Lee's reputation start, do you think? Because in the 20th century, it was perfectly possible for something like President Eisenhower and other military leaders, for instance, to openly admire Lee as a military commander. I think we'd be rather surprised today if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff cited General Lee as president, because we see him now in a different light, and we see the fatal decision he made and fighting the South, leading the South. But when did that change occur, that the sort of remaining reverence for him, for his military prowess, if nothing else, then turns a corner and actually Lee's name really starts to become very muddy?
Well, just to go back to 1870 for a moment, because initially when Robert E. Lee dies, he is a hero in the South, but he's not a hero in the North.
How does the North commemorate his death?
Well, there are some, the New York Times, for example, will note what he did at Washington College, which immediately becomes Washington Lee University, and how he accepted defeat, and they will give him credit for the final 5 years of his life. But they're not willing to overlook the fact that he is a traitor. It's in the 20th century that his reputation begins to change, that people come to see him as a unifying figure because of the role he played after the Civil War and accepting defeat, and also his military genius. If you go back and you look at the correspondence of our generals who fought in World War II, you mentioned Eisenhower, but General MacArthur, his mother, told him when he was a little boy, "I hope you grow up to be a soldier as great as Robert E. Lee." Harry Truman is reading a biography reads a biography of Robert E. Lee. General Marshall is corresponding with Robert E. Lee's most famous biographer during World War II, during the actual fighting, and saying, "I am reading about Lee's campaigns and taking solace in knowing that the challenges he faced are greater than the challenges I face." And so it sounds surprising to us today, but in a sense, these people grew up at the time that the statues were going up. This is the way they saw Robert E. Lee. And the statues, when we talk about tearing down a statue, well, what are we tearing down? You're not really going to erase Robert E. Lee from the history books. He's too important of a figure to erase. But what you are erasing is that there was generations that looked up to Robert E. Lee, including people who did very important work, I would say, in winning World War II.
So the turn in the reputation, the almost entirely negative turn, is a very recent thing in your view?
I think it begins in the 1970s and is carried on to right now, and Robert E. Lee's reputation is really as low as it could be. He is not respected as a military commander because people think he had the wrong strategy in the Civil War. He is seen as an icon of white supremacy, which,
is that accurate?
If you put him in context of his own time, there were Southerners arguing that slavery was a positive good on the eve of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee didn't make that argument. He said slavery was evil. He did say it was necessary, but he is certainly not an icon of the John C. Calhoun variety. Right. But that's where he's become. It's now Robert E. Lee is no longer a man. There's no longer a Robert E. Lee story. There's only the sort of symbolism that is imposed on him from people today who have suddenly noticed these features in our landscape.
And even Washington and Lee University is trying to rid itself of Lee. Either reputationally or actually. We should get onto that.
Well, there's been a lot of talk at Washington and Lee about the name. As I said, it went from Washington College to Washington and Lee University almost immediately after his death. And it's worth adding that the college probably would not have survived unless Robert E. Lee had surprisingly accepted that offer to become the president of the college. His name, you can imagine what it did for fundraising and also in terms of bringing new students.
And he's buried there.
He is buried there. Not just him, by the way. His whole family is buried there. There's a crypt with all the Lees, including Light Horse Harry Lee, whose body was brought there. And so it's very difficult to sort of remove the people from the places in a sense.